very happy to have Laurie Beaman here with us in Cebrap. She's been here with us for a week. She's collaborating with our team, and it was a very good week of debates and exchanging. She loved São Paulo, the rain and all the the beautiful city. It's a very good experience from someone who comes from Canada, the organization, the flow of everything. and she's the director of the Religion and Diversity Project in Canada, and a full professor of the Department of Classic and Religious Studies at the University of Ottawa. So she's been writing about religious freedom in Canada, and that's the big subject she works on. And today she's talking about the transition of religion as a cultural practice. This is the subject she's chosen to talk today with us. And then after her words, we can exchange a little bit some ideas and talk with her about her work. So thank you very much of your coming here today.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you everyone for coming. Paula, especially for the invitation to come and work with your team. It's been a pleasure to get to know a little bit about what you're doing. I regret that I have no Portuguese whatsoever except obrigada, and that's all I can say. So I have faced the challenge of trying to translate what I do into slow English, but not without compromising the complexity of the ideas, because my experience this week has been that everyone I've met is a complex thinker. But when we have a language barrier, sometimes it's a little bit more challenging. So first of all, when I speak, I tend to get very excited about ideas. And the more excited I get, the faster I talk. So please put your hand up or interrupt me. I really don't mind, because I'll forget, and then I'll start talking like this, and then you'll think if it's second language for you, then it's challenging. So don't hesitate at all. So when I chose the topic today, I tried to think about something that's happening in Canada that I think is happening maybe around the world. And at first, including in Brazil. And at first you might not think so, but conversations with Paula and her team have indicated to me that there is some of what's happening in Canada happening in Brazil as well. We share some commonalities, and of course we share, or we don't share many things, and there are many differences between Canada and Sao Paulo, not least of which is, of course, the weather. And I am grateful for the 26, 27 degree weather. Thank you very much, as compared to the minus 15 and minus 16. And if you don't know what that feels like, I invite you to come and visit the University of Ottawa and the Religion and Diversity Project and spend some time with us, freezing with us. Come dressed warmly. So I direct the Religion and Diversity Project, and the project is a 7-year project. We have 37 researchers. One of the things I realized about 3 years after I started the project was that I had made a very large mistake in my research design. And the very large mistake I had made was to not think at all about the Global South. And so therefore, through some chance encounters and the intervention of a very kind student here, Paula and I found each other, and I have been able to start working and thinking a little bit about Brazil in particular. So the other countries involved in my project, Canada, the United States, the UK or England, Australia, France. We've done a little bit of work comparing India and Canada, which might seem a bit like comparing a mouse and an elephant, and it sort of is.
Who is the mouse?
Definitely Canada, or much smaller. So doing comparative work is always challenging because the local specificities mean that sometimes it's simply difficult to find common ground. Paula and I have taken 2 meetings to figure out where we might head together as researchers looking for common ground. This is normal, I think, when we're dealing with 2 very different sites and countries. So 37 researchers, 4 primary research strands, and the research strands, I will tell you just quickly, we're looking at identity. How our project is focused on religion and diversity. That's the short title of it, and that's all that you need to know because that's what I call it, religion and diversity. We focus on identity. How do people talk about religious identity? How do we measure religious identity? In Canada, the United States, England, for example, measures of religious identity have long been institutional measures. So we're looking for ways to move outside of that. In other words, we don't measure religion and religious affiliation by how many times you go to church because, quite frankly, most people don't go to church anymore. But they're still up to something, we just don't know really what it is. So we're interested in developing more sophisticated ways of understanding what it means to talk about religious identity. The second area of focus is the regulation of religion. And here we're thinking about law specifically, but also other ways that religion might be regulated in more informal ways. So we think about that a bit, and so there's a group of us who concentrate a bit on that. The third area is sexuality and gender, of course looking at sometimes at the ways that these things collapse or collide or flow into one another. And then fourth is I think probably specifically a Canadian focus. It is intended to get beyond what we call tolerance and accommodation, because tolerance and accommodation is the language of both law and public discourse around how religion is, religious diversity should be responded to. But I say it's uniquely Canadian, but yet Europeans are adopting a Canadian legal framework which uses the notion of accommodation and so on. So it is uniquely Canadian, but it's not. So an emerging area that interests me in particular is around religious nuns. Now here I don't mean nuns as in the sisters, N-U-N-S, I mean nuns as in N-O-N-E. When you check a survey and you say, what is your religious affiliation, and you check no religion, that's the group that's interesting me right now. Partly because about 25% of Canadians situate themselves in this category, more British, I think it's up around 30-35%. About the same number, 25% of Australians. In the US, it's slightly lower, about 20% of the population, and so on. So I think, and I'm not the first person to observe this, that what is happening is a kind of polarization. Increased discussion of religious diversity in the public sphere, an increased understanding of religion as actually being around specific orthodoxies, and then a growing population of people who have no religion. And some of them are atheists, some of them are agnostics, some of them are humanists, some of them are unconcerned, some of them could care less, some of them are spiritual but not religious. It's a huge category. It encompasses a large number of people and a large variety of sorts of responses to the question, what's your religion? So this category, I don't know what kind of resonance this category has in Brazil. It's not entirely clear to me because I don't know enough about Brazil. Paula and I have talked about it a little bit. Atheists are quite marginal here. I would say in some measure atheists are quite marginal in Canada as well, but I think the way it translates in public discourse is a little bit different. So yeah, I think it's worth thinking about in Brazil. I think there's less social acceptability in Brazil to say you're an atheist than there is in Canada. In Canada, it's not that big a deal if you say you're an atheist. But this idea of nun may take a different form here. Cultural Catholicism, for example. but still this idea of non-participation in organized religion. So one of the things that interests me is how this emerging category of nuns, or people who have no religion, this group as social and legal actors. So I've focused a little bit on that in some of my work most recently. So how are they reshaping or attempting to reshape public understandings, public discourse, and public presence of religion specifically? And particularly in the face of an increasingly diverse religious population. That's happening here too, maybe not quite to the same level as it is in Canada, in Britain, in the United States, and in Australia, but it's still a factor in Brazil, I believe. So how is this group reshaping how we think about religion and interacting in the public sphere? So like Brazil, in Canada, we imagine ourselves as culturally plural. We have an imaginary or a narrative about ourselves that's been primarily constructed around the notion of multiculturalism. That's our buzzword. More than pluralism, more than diversity, we think we're multicultural, whatever that might mean. So multiculturalism, it's a complex entry point. It can describe a demographic reality. In other words, there is a reality of people from different places, from different backgrounds, of different ethnic makeups, who comprise this thing we call Canada. So that's a demographic reality. It can be an ideology around thinking something called multiculturalism is good. It is also a legal concept. It's found in our Charter of Rights, which was enacted in 1982, around the same time as yours, 88, yes? 88. Yeah. So it's found in our charter. Section 27 says that we need to interpret the Charter in accordance with Canada's multicultural heritage. It doesn't say what exactly that means, but so the Charter also protects freedom of religion and freedom of conscience. And unlike the United States, we don't have a separation of church and state. We don't have that establishment clause that maybe some of you are familiar with from the US. Although I've argued that the US also doesn't have a separation of church and state. They just say they do. But it's worth considering what the constitutions actually say. So human rights legislation in the provinces of Canada largely reflect the broader values of the Canadian Charter. So there are these bits of legislation that talk about religion, religious freedom, and creed. So what then does or should religious freedom and freedom of conscience look like in this diverse Canada, or this multicultural Canada that we imagine? How do we reconcile the presence of religious symbols in the public sphere by majoritarian religion? And majoritarian religion in Canada is basically historically 50% Protestant, 50% Catholic. And we talked about this earlier in the week about what Protestantism looks like. It doesn't look the same in Canada as it looks in Brazil. I think when people think about Protestantism here, they think Pentecostalism, charismatic, a whole different sort of Protestantism than when I think about Protestantism in Canada, which is largely United Church of Canada, Anglicanism. Pretty sedate. There's no kind of televangelism. That's not something I associate with Protestantism in Canada. And I think it's important to make that distinction when we're doing some comparative work. So 50% Protestant, 50% Catholic. The numbers have shifted a little bit, and they tend to shift over the years. And then always in Canada, not unlike Brazil, is the presence of Aboriginal religion, First Nations peoples. Not particularly powerful, I would say, to put it bluntly, but it's a voice that's always there, and it's always preoccupied the colonizers. What to do about Aboriginals? And the first attempt was to eliminate. They were seen as not having religion, and therefore they needed to be Christianized. And then they were seen as needing to somehow be controlled, their language be controlled, and so on and so forth. So there's always been this tense relationship around Aboriginals, around the First Nations peoples, and they continue to have a voice, and I think hopefully a stronger voice in present-day Canada than they have historically. But it's a third presence that I think in some measure defines how we think about Canada. So again, how then do we reconcile the presence of symbols which largely reflect majoritarian religion, i.e. Christianity, in Canada, with this notion of multiculturalism and diverse Canada and diverse religious traditions, and particularly of late, increasing numbers of people who are not Christian, to put it quite bluntly. Some people would argue for a banishment, what we might call a banishment model, like laïcité in France, in Turkey, this sort of a model. Other people argue for pluralism, a pluralism model, inviting multiple symbols into the so-called public sphere. And of course, state neutrality, if we want to talk about neutrality, is conceptualized differently in these cases, and indeed I think each country has its own model or models of what constitutes so-called state neutrality. I'm not sure that neutrality is at all possible. So perhaps in tension with this openness to multiculturalism and diversity is a narrative of our values, and that's an increasing narrative in Canada. And I think it's this story of us, who we are, is particularly prevalent when the subject is Muslims. And this is much more an issue right now in Canada, much more present, much more public than it is for you in Brazil. In fact, the first time I came to Brazil and I was meeting with a group, we were meeting mostly about the topic of neoliberalism, and it was the most refreshing thing to me that for an entire week we did not talk, when we talked about religion, we did not actually talk about Muslims. And that was refreshing to me because it's the core preoccupation right now in Canada. So you'd be very happy, Elaine. So this has been reflected in things like Canada's Citizenship and Immigration Guide, in this statements of values such as "we do not accept," and these words are used, barbarian practices, such as honor killing. This is clearly targeted at new Muslim immigrants. It doesn't say that specifically, but when we refer to barbarian practices such as honor killing, that's what we're talking about. Of course, this ignores the prevalence of violence against women globally. It ignores the prevalence of violence against women in Canada. And globally, we can talk about Brazil, we can talk about India, we can talk about Canada, we can talk about the United States. It's a pervasive problem. So it's in this context that I discuss one case that's currently being decided by the Supreme Court of Canada. The decision also draws from a European case, so I will mention that one as well. That's the Lautsi decision, for those of you who know this area at all. That's a case from the Grand Chamber of the European Court of Human Rights, and it's mentioned in the Canadian case. So I'll mention that case a little bit too. These cases both involve atheists. I think, though, it would be a mistake to characterize them as being only about atheism. So please don't let your eyes glaze over just because you think this is not really pertinent to some of the things because I know many of you are thinking about religion and diversity in different ways. These cases raise broader questions about the place of majoritarian religion, the place of Christianity in the case of Canada, and the case of Brazil, and the case of the UK, and the case of Australia. Broader questions about the place of majoritarian religion in democracies. So I think that it's not wise to just think they're about atheists. And they raise these questions in the face of increased religious diversity and, of course, declining participation in majoritarian religion. And I think if I have to look to the future, again, what I think is perhaps the most worrisome possibility is increased tension and conflict between the non-religious and the religious. And I think that's perhaps where the next frontier of conflict, at least in Canada, and I'm seeing signs that it's the case elsewhere as well. So what's the case about? The case is called Saguenay, So I'll refer it to the Saguenay case. Paula, also, will you kind of let me know when time is starting to, because
It works. How long we have to? It goes into 2? Yes, until 2. Okay, you have a lot of time.
I hope you ate sandwiches and drank lots before you came.
Maybe, yeah, 20 minutes.
Okay, so the Saguenay case, what's it about? What's it about? The other problem is I'm used to standing when I talk, so if I start fidgeting like I'm 3 years old, that's why. It's about a prayer, it's about a crucifix and a statue of the Virgin Mary in the City Council meeting room of the city of Saguenay in Quebec, Canada. So the prayer, I'll just want to read it to you so that you can see what it is we're talking about. The prayer. I, by the way, just as an aside, I shouldn't take time and do this, but I gave a talk to the Secularism Network, and they both mostly basically study atheists, and I started my talk with the prayer just to be a little bit bad. It sort of made them a bit nervous, I think. O God, eternal and almighty, from whom all power and wisdom flow, we're assembled here in your presence to ensure the good of our city and its prosperity. We beseech you to grant us the enlightenment and energy necessary for our deliberations to promote the honor and glory of your holy name and the spiritual and material happiness of our city. Amen. Now, before the prayer was said, the mayor of Saguenay made the sign of the cross. And so this is what attracts the controversy, I suppose. It's the combination of the mayor in a public meeting, making the sign of the cross, and beginning his council meeting, or their council meeting, with this particular prayer. While there's a crucifix hanging on the wall and a statue of the Virgin Mary in the corner. So the characters in this drama, one is Alain Simoneau. So we have the city of Saguenay. Alain Simoneau is a man who lives in Saguenay. He happens to be an atheist. He goes to city council meetings to participate as a citizen, to help make decisions about what's happening in the city, about the important things that cities do, like decide about water and sewer and dogs and cats and whatever else is happening in the city. And he goes and he endures this prayer and the crucifix and the statue of the Virgin Mary, and he files a complaint with the Quebec Human Rights Tribunal, arguing that this violates his freedom of conscience. And the city says no, it doesn't. The complaint is, it gets a little bit convoluted because we have the Human Rights Commission who decides whether the case goes forward. They say, yeah, there's a case here, but we're not going to do anything about it. Mr. Simoneau then takes it to the next level, which is the Human Rights Tribunal in Quebec. The Human Rights Tribunal says, yes, there's been a violation of your freedom of conscience by everyone having to say this prayer. Although he's not forced to say it, he can sit in silence if he wants to. But the saying of a prayer before a council meeting is not appropriate in a nation, in a province that claims to be, if you will, secular. So this is the tribunal decision. Now, at the tribunal hearing, there are numerous experts who are called to give evidence, and the main position of the city is that these things are not religious. The crucifix is not religious, the statue of the Virgin Mary is not religious, and the prayer is not really religious. And this is the city's position, despite the mayor making the sign of the cross beforehand and saying, Heavenly Father, or whatever it is he says, and making statements to the media that are quite controversial. At one point, he says that he's quite proud of this, and he describes the whole matter as a fight. And I'll see if I can find his quote quickly, but I won't waste time on it. He says that he's proud of this fight and that he hopes that when he dies, he can get to heaven and he can say to God, I did this fight for you. So at the same time he's saying it's not religious, he's also saying he's going to get to heaven and he hopes he can say to God, I went to court for you. I don't know. It strikes me maybe as a little bit religious, but So that's Mayor Tremblay. That's his name. So we have this bunch of experts who come in also at the tribunal hearing and give evidence that in fact the prayer isn't really Christian. It's a prayer that represents universal values. The crucifix is not really a crucifix. One of the experts testifies that it doesn't meet canonical standards of a crucifix. Now, this might be familiar to you. Apparently, the artist who carves the statue, who carves the crucifix, pardon me, comes and gives evidence too, and talks about how he carved it with its hands, Jesus, with his hands open, so that it would, and this posture might be familiar to you as Brazilians, I don't know, and that he carved it in a way to sort of indicate that he's watching over the council as they do their business and to make sure that they realize the seriousness of their business. The city's position is that this is not really religious, and the expert they call says, it doesn't meet canonical standards of a crucifix. I didn't know there were canonical standards for crucifixes, but this is not really my area of expertise. So they call an expert who says the prayer is not really religious. It's a kind of modern theology and open to everyone, and that everyone can engage in this prayer without feeling as though they're forced to be engaging in Christian behavior. So this is the sort of story that unfolds. This is all the evidence that's given at the tribunal. The tribunal says, the Quebec Human Rights Tribunal says there's a violation of your human rights with these things. The thing that really bothers Monsieur Simoneau is the saying of the prayer. He says the crucifix and the statue he can kind of live with, but the saying of the prayer bothers him specifically. So the tribunal says, yes, your rights have been violated. Here we award you some damages, some money and orders the council to stop doing this prayer, to remove the crucifix and to remove the statue of the Virgin Mary. The objection is that it's in the council chambers. This is where decisions are made about what happens in the day-to-day life of the municipality. There's not even a discussion about maybe the crucifix could be in the entry hall, or maybe the statue could be in a separate public area in the building. It's simply, his objection is really the link between the prayer, the crucifix, and the statue, and the doing of essentially state business or municipality business. The case is appealed. The case is appealed to the Quebec Court of Appeal. The Quebec Court of Appeal takes the expert, so new evidence is not offered at the Court of Appeal level. In our courts of appeal, you rarely see new evidence. So no new experts are called. What the Court of Appeal does is reassess the evidence that's been presented already. And the Court of Appeal says, the prayer, the tribunal, I should tell you, the tribunal has already decided, yes, the prayer is Christian, yes, the crucifix is religious. So basically says, no, this argument won't hold. At the Court of Appeal, the opposite approach is taken. The Court of Appeal says the prayer represents universal values, and it's not really religious, and it's not specifically religious. The crucifix, same thing, it's a universal symbol, and so on and so forth, and same with the statue of the Virgin Mary. The crucifix is held out as it's just a piece of art. That's how it's described, basically. They call the artist, and he implies that he's done this with religious intention, but the Court of Appeal says, no, it's just a piece of art. And so the Court of Appeal essentially says there's been no violation of Monsieur Simoneau's rights. Now what happens is the case goes to the Supreme Court of Canada. And it was heard last fall, and we wait. There's no decision yet. So who knows what will happen? I'm anxious because this is what I like to think about, but who knows what will happen? So that's the story. Now, a couple of other pieces of information, and I'll talk a little bit more about the decision and this transformation of religion to culture and heritage. But a couple of other things you should know about Quebec, because I think it's important to know the context. Quebec, like Brazil, largely a Catholic province, historically Catholic. 85% of Quebecers still say when they tick the box, they don't tick none, they tick Catholic, Roman Catholic, 85%. But nobody goes to church. And they have a very complicated relationship with this Catholic Church that is theirs but not theirs. The complication of the relationship is made up of a number of factors. One is that people perceive the Catholic Church as having been a participant in the oppression of French Canadians. And so they want to punish, essentially, the church and say, you will never do this to us again. And I'm simplifying a bit, but you will never do this to us again. And so Quebec is trying right now to carve out a new model of secularism or laïcité. Some people want to import the French model. Some people say, no, we should have what they call laïcité ouverte, so open secularism, which is a bad translation, but it's the best we can do. So there are various people, various tensions in Quebec about what does this new society look like? Not actually unlike what's happening here. What does this Brazil look like that is not only Catholic, but now has some other, now we need to make sure we are taking account of Afro-Brazilian religion, also this new Protestantism that seems to have many Brazilians quite worried. What do we do with all this? How do we reshape this in a model of society that we can live with? How do we want this to look? Quebec is doing the same thing. It's undergoing a process whereby it says, are we a secular society? Do we banish all these symbols from the public sphere or not? So it has a big commission called the Bouchard-Taylor Commission. Some of you may know Charles Taylor's work. He's a relatively well-known philosopher. He's one of those, the Bouchard-Taylor. He's the Taylor part of that commission. They go around Quebec. They hear people, public debates, public discussions. They receive 900 submissions from people about what's on their minds about a diverse, plural Quebec. And what really is on people's minds, it turns out, is religion. And what really is on people's minds, especially it would seem, would be, first, I think, Muslims. Second, I would say Sikhs. And third, Jews. And there's a long-standing Jewish community in Montreal, especially, that there's ongoing tension. It's an Orthodox Jewish community, ongoing tension around their activities too. So those are other cases that I could talk about, but I have not enough time. So there's an ongoing public debate in Quebec about how society should look, specifically around religion. The Saguenay case takes place in that context. So you need to understand that about Quebec, about those public debates happening as Saguenay is decided, and the Court of Appeal, the tribunal saying, yes, this is a violation, and the Court of Appeal saying, these things are our culture and heritage. This is who we are as a people. That this is not religion, although some people will admit there's religion, but it's culture, it's heritage. And so not only should it stay, the state has a duty to protect these things. So in a sense, the state has a duty to protect and preserve what has essentially been majoritarian religion in Quebec. It has a duty to protect these signs of Roman Catholicism. So the Bouchard-Taylor Commission is this one piece of information that you need to understand how the case unfolds and the various streams of thinking about. The Court of Appeal is saying, really, we want to think about a model that still allows for a fairly predominant public place for Roman Catholicism in Quebec, even if we don't want to imagine it as a religion. The tribunal says, no, this is not how a diverse Quebec should look. We're not quite sure maybe how it should look, but it's not going to have crucifixes, statues of the Virgin Mary, and prayers at the beginning of council meetings. By the way, a kind of amusing piece of information, when the tribunal met to hear this case, they went into the room and one of the tribunal commissioners said, oh my God, there's a crucifix on the wall. So she said, we need to find a room with no crucifix on the wall to hear this case. So it was kind of funny that even in the sort of courtroom, there's still this very strong presence of majoritarian religion, if you will. So the Bouchard-Taylor Commission is one piece. The Bouchard-Taylor Commission, by the way, decides that in this new religiously diverse Quebec, that no longer should the crucifix hang in what they call the Assemblée Nationale, which is the major legislative house of Quebec. So the Bouchard-Taylor Commission makes a number of recommendations after hearing all these people, 900 submissions, and says, one of the recommendations we have is that this crucifix must come down. And unanimously, on the day the report is released, the Assemblée Nationale meets. Every member in that house from all political parties say the crucifix must stay. So this is the joke about the effectiveness of the Bouchard-Taylor Commission report. And so the crucifix has stayed until this day. So that's the Quebec context. Now I'll mention the Italian case, because in the Court of Appeal decision, which says the crucifix should stay, this decision from the European Grand Chamber is cited, the Lauzi decision from Italy. It involves an atheist mother who goes to her children's classroom and sees a crucifix hanging on the wall. It's a public school. She says, I don't want this crucifix hanging in my children's classroom. And the Lauzi decision is a very good decision in the sense that if you're interested in how law talks about religion and imagines religion, it's a good decision to romp through. And I usually choose quotations from Justice Bonello's decision, which is not really fair because he's probably the most colorful judge of all who writes this, but I like his decisions. I don't agree with him, but I like his decisions because they're colorful and he says things that maybe he shouldn't say. I don't know if I dare say that about one of the Grand Chamber justices. So he talks about, in Italy, and I'll see if I can find the quote quickly, he talks about the role of the crucifix and the presence of religion in Italy. And this is where we start to see a really clear articulation of this idea of the crucifix, and in that case there's no prayer, it's only the crucifix. But the crucifix as maybe not being strictly religious, that it's really about culture and heritage, and that it represents, so he has this great quote. I do have to see if I can find it, because I think it's kind of fun. Where's Justice? Okay, he says, this is Justice Bonello speaking. I'm channeling him, so just bear with me. Moreover, with the benefit of hindsight, he says, it's easy to identify in the constant central core of Christian faith, despite the Inquisition, despite anti-Semitism, despite the Crusades, the principles of human dignity, tolerance, and freedom, including religious freedom, and therefore, in the last analysis, the foundations of the secular state. So for him, this crucifix, as he said, despite, we'll just forget about the Crusades and all the nasty things the church has done, but really what it represents is dignity, human rights, freedom, freedom of religion, and in fact is the foundation of everything we know. So this is the Lauzi decision. The Lauzi decision considers this argument. This is one of the arguments of the Italian government, but quite a number of interveners as well from across Europe intervened to make this argument that this is part of our heritage. This is part of our culture. You can't just take this away. And Justice Bonello agrees. He says, we can't just take this away. And he makes another really great statement about Italy and the heritage of Italy. And he says, again, I recommend you read the judgment if you're interested at all in this stuff. He says, but Justice Bonello again, a court of human rights cannot allow itself to suffer from historical Alzheimer's. It has no right to disregard the cultural continuum of a nation's flow through time, nor to ignore what, over the centuries, has served to mold and define the profile of a people. No supernatural court has any business substituting its own ethical mock-ups for those qualities that history has imprinted on the national identity. On a human rights court falls the function of protecting fundamental rights but never ignoring that customs are not passing whims. They evolve over time, harden over history into cultural cement. They become defining, all-important badges of identity for nations, tribes, religions, and individuals. So the Lao-Tzu case, again, it establishes the tone and the idea that religious symbols can be converted into culture and heritage, and that in fact they hold meaning such that they are universal, they represent universal values. So even when people say, no, that does not represent me, no, that's not part of who I am, the court maintains, the Grand Chamber, the European Court of Human Rights maintains that this is the foundation of our society, and you can't rid yourself of it. So this is what the Saguenay Court of Appeal, the Court of Appeal in Quebec in the Saguenay case relies on to say this is culture and heritage. So what I really am interested in this case is this emerging discursive construction of majoritarian religion as not really being religion, or only partly religion, or that religious symbols are passive symbols. And even if you step to the other side and you are in favor of some kind of presence of religious symbols in the public sphere, the characterization of religious symbols as passive, I think, is deeply offensive too, to those who adhere to a religious worldview. So there's no winning in this. Either for those who find the symbols disturbing, to use a word that Monsieur Simoneau uses, then to characterize the symbol as passive does one piece of work, but for those for whom the symbol is deeply meaningful, to characterize it as passive is also problematic, because it's not passive, it's deeply meaningful, and it's an integral part of people's lives in some cases. So as I said, either way there's no winning, if you will. So I'm interested in this shift from religion, heritage, or from religion to culture and heritage. I'm interested also in this imagined universal ethic that's represented by this religion that's not religion. The construction of this as being somehow universal, representative of all of us, representing universal values and so on. And that, at least in the Lao-Tzu case, there's a sort of implication that, in the Court of Appeal too, there's a sort of implication that this is only possible with religion. That never mind the Declaration of Human Rights and so on. So the third thing that interests me is the imagined good citizen. So who this good citizen values and accepts this universal message conveyed by those not really religious symbols and practices, even if he or she self-describes as none. And one of the interesting things that happens in both Lao-Tzu and in the Saguenay case is the characterization of the complainants. In Lao-Tzu, Justice Bonello in particular is quite vitriolic about Ms. Lao-Tzu, the woman who complains. And he makes some fairly nasty statements about her, implying that she's a bad citizen, not a good Italian, and that she's unreasonable, radical. Now, those are not his exact words, and I don't have his quote here, but this statement about her is quite harsh. In the Court of Appeal, in Saguenay, the same thing happens. Alain Simoneau is characterized as radical, as unreasonable, as driven by ideology, and one of the experts actually goes so far as to say that his desire to challenge the state and the city in its maintenance of the presence of these symbols, his desire to challenge them is actually indicative of some kind of a psychological problem. So this idea of the good citizen, you can be a nun, you cannot believe, but you can't challenge the presence of anything that might look like a religious symbol. Because if you do, you're characterized as being too radical. One of the other expert witnesses in the Court of Appeal, or in the Saguenay case, also says that his position is too radical for a democracy. And of course, expressing your wishes through a legal process rather than through, say, an act of terror or violence, would seem to me to be actually the epitome of what we imagine happens in a democracy, where people use the rights and obligations that are assigned to them and try to navigate their way through. He tried to work it out with the city council, by the way. He tried at first to say, could we come to another arrangement? And, couldn't we have a moment of silence instead of a prayer and so on? And one of the things that happened, he found little wooden crosses thrown in his truck when he went to a car wash with Seminários the Christian written on it. And then he received threatening phone calls. They're not sure, I think it was from the mayor or his brother. The threatening phone calls were harsh enough that the police found that there was enough evidence to lay criminal charges, but they refused to do so. So it kind of gives you a sense of what the good citizen needs to look like in this particular kind of a situation. The prayer, I'm not sure there's much more that I can say about the prayer. How's time?
You have 5 minutes.
5 minutes, oh, okay. I'll talk maybe then a little bit more about what the court says about the prayer. So what the court does is it calls, as I've mentioned, it calls on these experts to talk about the meaning of the prayer and whether it's actually religious. The mayor says that the prayer, Monsieur Tremblay, the man who makes the sign of the cross before he says the prayer, says that the prayer is inclusive and it includes the beliefs of everyone, including atheists. Although the atheist before him says it doesn't, he insists that no, it really does include Monsieur Seminários. And he stated at the tribunal hearing, the mayor stated, that the municipal council decided to pursue the tradition of reciting the prayer, which was considered an important one, underpinning the foundation of the city, the values to be upheld, and the development of families. So again, you see this this bringing forward of the prayer is somehow representative, not just of a religion, but of the entire foundation of society, in this case, the entire foundation of the city of Saguenay. The most interesting piece of expert testimony was, I think, related to this prayer around being said at the council meeting, pardon me. The one expert described the prayer as not being just for Christians, but as I said, as part of a theistic modernity. And she also noted that, and these are her words, in the present context, interpreting attachment to a prayer as evidence of submission of those in authority to a higher power is abusive and does not take into account so-called religious modernity. So again, you see this kind of turning on its head of someone saying, this is not appropriate in a secular society, and the expert and the court turning this around and saying, no, you're being abusive by even saying that you could possibly be offended by the prayer. So it's a kind of interesting turning on its head. And I've talked about the good citizen, so I won't say anything more, I think. So I think I'll sort of draw this to a conclusion so we have some time to talk. As I mentioned at the beginning, I think the legal constructions reflect this, a sort of will to, what I've called a will to religion. This is following kind of mapping Foucauldian language, and I know that from the conversation this week that you're quite familiar with that language, so, or some of you are anyway. So it's a will to religion that places certain beliefs and practices, such as atheism and minority religions, under scrutiny while exempting others. And that's one of my main worries about this. By characterizing prayer before council meetings, presence of crucifixes and so on, as culture and heritage, essentially what it does is it removes those from scrutiny. And so when we have discussions of religious freedom, really what we're talking about, the people who are scrutinized are minority religious groups and not majoritarian religious culture, if you will. That gets exempted as part of our heritage, our culture, something to be protected, and indeed as a generator of our values. And so you can't really argue with it. You can't say, no, that's not right. Because when someone says, well, this is part of our culture and heritage, it becomes much more difficult to then challenge that as somehow infringing on one's freedom of religion or freedom of conscience. I want to specifically mention, for those of you who are interested in this kind of idea of the will to religion, the work of Winifred Sullivan. She's on my research team. I'm lucky, I'm fortunate in that I've collaborated with her, and we've both talked about, we've done a book together, and one of the things we've agreed on is that every nation has an establishment of religion. It's just a matter of figuring out what that establishment looks like. It takes different forms, and establishment is very much American language, I'm quite aware of that, but that every nation has a religious history, and it's simply asking the question, how is that embedded in the practices, in the institutions, in the legal definitions and understandings of what constitutes religion or what constitutes a good citizen? These things are all embedded, and it's important to take them apart. The will to religion is the idea that we're all religious, that we all have spiritual needs, and that those needs are available for scrutiny, examination, correction, regulation, and addressing, both by ourselves and by others. These spiritual needs are assessed in terms of imagined universal criteria that are largely based in Christian understandings of religion. In addition, the will to religion imagines us, all of us, as being indebted to religion, specifically Christianity, for the moral foundation of society. And I should point out that despite my critical approach to the construction of Christianity as foundational to morality, I think it's important to acknowledge that it has and can and does contribute to acts of good and to moral foundations. Many people are motivated by their religious commitment to act on poverty, environmental destruction, sexual discrimination, and so on. So it's not a denial of the importance or the role of religion, positive, we might say, role of religion. But my objection is to the transposition of this realm of belief, practice, and action into a universal in which we must all participate. And indeed, in the eyes of the courts I've looked at, that we do all participate in this realm. It's also important to identify the influence of Christianity on social institutions and structure. But identifying is not validating. It's a necessary step to a deeper examination and conversation about how to shape social institutions to create space for multiple voices. The approach in the Saguenay case with the Court of Appeal decision recognizes the weight of Christian history, but validates it rather than assesses it. Alain Simoneau, the atheist in this case, presented the court with an exceptional opportunity to attempt to think more deeply about the implications of the religious dominance of Christian ritual and symbol in Quebec, and more broadly. Unfortunately, the court didn't take him up on that. And I want to be clear, again, I'm not suggesting that it has to be tossed out, but if we claim to be a multicultural Canada, which we do, or a diverse or a plural society, we have to re-navigate this, and it has to be put on the table of, well, what is the influence of our majoritarian religion? How can we talk about that? How can we make space for everyone in a way that still honors what is legitimate culture and heritage, but at the same time makes space for other people to feel welcome, or makes space for all to feel welcome? And I always say, people are willing to say, oh yes, well, okay, you can wear the hijab, or you can bring your Quran or whatever. But when we talk, this is a little controversial, but when we talk about the Raelians or the Scientologists, or here the Afro-Brazilians, then people get a little bit more tense. And maybe they're not as sure that they want those symbols. The Raelians, it might be a UFO, so that, you can see that might prompt people to be a little bit nervous. Contrary to the argument of atheists that one can be good without God, legal discourse is shaping a new rhetoric of the foundational nature of religion to the common good, an idea that presses even those who do not believe to believe, or to at least accept the inherent value of God in the creation of a good society. We're only good because of God in this read, and can only be secular because of the foundation laid by religion. And of course, we've talked about the relationship this week between the secular and the religious and how they constitute each other. The universal truth of religion becomes then inescapable and impossible to opt out of. And this relatively new legal rhetoric has increased traction in a number of democracies whose majoritarian religion would seem to be in decline. Law is coming to the rescue here, I think, carving out a new place for religion as fundamental to societal well-being, and religious practices and symbols in state institutions are therefore an acceptable and even a welcome presence, so the religious symbols stay. In Brazil, the situation is perhaps different, but maybe not so different. I rely on you to assess that, as you're, of course, much better placed than I am to analyze this. And it's an incredibly complicated country with an incredibly complicated history. I'd only ask you that when you do your own analysis, you think not so much of the marginal place of atheists, but rather how challenges to political, social, religious orders evoke particular responses, and then to scrutinize what those responses tell us about ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much.